Alright, greetings. Welcome to the last chapter we're going to be covering in our course. This is CJC 111, Introduction to Criminal Justice. These lectures are being recorded in the summer of 2022. They should serve for about the next year. We are using the 11th edition, which is the newest edition. We're switching over from the 10th. Of Criminal Justice in Action, published by Cengage. The two principal authors are Larry Gaines and Roger Leroy Miller. As I said, this is going to be the last chapter. If you have a previous edition text, there was 16 chapters in most of those. They had a chapter on 16 was terrorism and issues in cyber law or internet, which was a very popular kind of buzz going around the field. I think it's died down perhaps just a little bit. So this chapter is not quite as long as some of the others, and it's kind of an outlier. Again, though, this chapter reflects a course that we teach here separately at Wake Tech. So if you're interested, we do have a course on juvenile justice, which I would recommend for you to take a look at. So this, again, is really only going to give us an overview. It can't give us a lot of detailed information in such a short period of time. These lectures typically are going to take about 50 minutes, and then there's usually questions or illustrations I give in class. Obviously, if you're watching the recorded lecture, you're not getting that little bit of experience, but this is the shortest of the chapters in the text. Most of them are, if you look at the relative length, most of them are 30 or 40 pages long, and this one is barely 20. So it's a good deal shorter than the others. So perhaps we'll get you out of here a little bit early if you're following along. Let's go ahead and jump in. So as we start to talk about the juvenile justice system, as we start to talk about any of the topics we've talked about in this course, any of the 15 chapters we cover, I like to begin by challenging you to think about some things as you read through. The most valuable skill you can learn is to be a critical thinker or a critical reader when you get information. And you should ask, how is this information being given to me? How trustworthy is this information? What is being presented to me, but also what is not being presented to me? Because very often what's being admitted can shape your entire experience. Okay, so let's ask some questions here that maybe were admitted or maybe are issues that are floating around. And the first one I think is a pretty fair question. Why should juveniles get a special system? Why did we decide that an age, say, okay, everyone who's below this age gets a separate legal system? Why shouldn't we have, for example, we apply this to different ages? Why shouldn't there be an elderly system? Instead of a juvenile system, a geriatric system of law. Or, you can also apply this to other groups. Why not handicapped people? People who are mentally handicapped have a completely separate system. We do a little bit to some extent, have a completely separate system for those who have a mental handicap or challenged. What about people who are veterans? I mean, we have veterans courts now. What about business? I mean, you can see that once you open this can of worms up, once you say that there should be multiple systems, where do you draw the line and say no more? Okay, so something to think about. Second question I think is fair to ask is, you should be aware that juvenile records are very often sealed and unavailable. Okay, why? And you say, well, maybe we're trying to protect the juvenile. Well, should we protect everybody? Should we protect the victim that was harmed by the juvenile? Or maybe if the juvenile is important enough and you say, well, if a record follows a juvenile around, it's unfair to him. Maybe that's true for everybody. So, an obvious question is, why? What's the best way to treat a juvenile inside the system? There's a bit of a dichotomy between the idea of, I guess, a sort of get tough, get the juvenile under control type attitude, and also the very older idea of paterfamilia, that that the father or the family is of central concern. So is the family a better option than the state? What do you do if the state is broken, if there's insufficient resources in the state to take care of a juvenile? What do you do if the family is broken, if there's insufficient resources to take care of them? What other purposes are served by the juvenile system? Is there some reason that poor people, men, and minorities are overrepresented inside the system? I think, again, fair questions to ask. Those are your last learning objectives, and again, these are just general topics that we hope that by the close of this you'll understand and really have a foundation, and just a foundation, not an extensive understanding of this topic. Okay, let's talk a little bit about where this all comes from, the child-saving movement. Really, there was a whole series of social reform movements that start in the early 1800s, and some of them start a little bit earlier. Slavery is one of anti-slavery or abolitionist movements are pretty early. Some of them start just a little bit later. Some of them are very successful. They get very big. Some of them are not. So three that we could talk about here that are not strictly speaking part of the juvenile movement. The abolition of slavery, which of course will culminate in the 1860s with the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the civil rights, the so-called Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. The prohibition, the idea that alcohol is an evil in the society and that it should be banned nationally. So we have the constitutional amendment to prohibition really comes in. It's about a 10-year experiment. It lasts from about 1919, or we'll say 1920, to about 1930. So it's about a 10-year period of time where we experimented with making alcohol illegal. Didn't work out too well, but again, it was to reform society because the damage alcohol was doing. The thought was, let's remove it. Suffrage, universal suffrage, and this was the idea of extending the rights of the citizens to women, giving them full rights. Obviously, one of the first things was giving them the right to vote. And this had a constitutional amendment associated with it too. And again, this was bubbling up as early as the 1800s. Certainly by the 1850s and 60s, we saw suffragette movements. We saw the Niagara Convention. We saw Susan B. Anthony and others. But it took close to 100 years, really, to get the amendment to the U.S. Constitution to get universal suffrage for women, and still something that continues today. The child-saving movement was part of this. Traditionally, there was the idea, the old idea of paterfamilia, and this is a Latin term meaning essentially the father is the head of the family. The father is supreme. And the issue here, I think, was that people began to appreciate or realize that very often families were broken. There could be absent fathers. There could be fathers that were neglectful. And that the state could step in as the ultimate parent. So the idea kind of to replace paterfamilia is parens patria, which is that the state can intervene to protect children. And this occurred in different ways. I mean, there's some really fascinating ways it occurred in bits and pieces across the United States. And I recommend if you take our course on juvenile justice, you delve into this a little bit deep. We don't have a lot of time to look at that history. So early on, before this child-saving movement really gains grounds, juveniles essentially were treated just like adults. There was really only two stages in the law. You were either an infant, in which you were not responsible at all for your actions, or you were an adult. And so there was no transitional teenage years. Now, very gradually, the child savers brought to the attention of society at large and the law that juveniles were not yet complete adults. They might physically be bigger, but mentally they were still undergoing these changes. And so very gradually they tried to establish separate homes, separate prisons, separate treatments for juveniles. One of the first ones was New York City's House of Refuge, which opens in 1825. And eventually the state starts to kind of regulate children and young adults. Now, some of this is for their own benefit. Some of this has very altruistic motives. There's a few darker motives here as well. The formal juvenile court system would take another generation. If we have the House of Refuge in 1825, it's really not until 1900, 1899 if you will, that Illinois creates really the first separate court system for juveniles. And over the next 45 years, all of the states, in this case it would be just 48 states because Alaska and Hawaii aren't admitted until after 1950, all 48 states adopt some type of juvenile system. Now, North Carolina does this about 1915 when we passed the Probation Courts Act, and it establishes the idea of dependent and delinquent or juvenile delinquent status. It also separated out juvenile trials. It created separate facilities of records and incarcerations for juveniles. So this is really the birth in North Carolina of our system. Now we kind of did it on the cheap. If you go to juvenile court today, you might say, well, there's a separate juvenile court judge, right, Mr. Chapman? And the answer would be, not really. What we do is we would go, so take Wake County here where Raleigh is located. You would go there and you would find a district court judge who on other days might be handling traffic cases or drunk cases or stuff like that. So, when I was doing it, it was very often Joyce Hamilton. Before that, Jerry Leonard did a lot of it. These judges one day would just wear a different hat. They would be the juvenile court judges. And this was a recognition that children were not fully responsible. It was kind of growing up in tandem with a better understanding of mental illness, which is not to say being a juvenile is a mentally ill status. But what it is to say is that it has to do with the mind and its full development. So we begin to say a juvenile may be physically big enough, but mentally they haven't really completed their transition to become an adult, and we need to treat them differently. Now, there are two categories under our scheme of regulating juveniles. There are status offenders, or status offending, and delinquency. So a status offense is something that if you as an adult did, and I'm going to assume that most of you listening to this are over 18, you're in college after all. This is something that if you did it, it's not a crime. It could be not going to class. Well, I have students that don't go to class. I don't call the truant officers and go and have them arrested. I might send them a note and say, if you don't come to class, you can fail, but that's about all that's going to happen. On the other hand, if you're under a certain age, if you're 10 or 12 and you just stop going to school, that's an offense. And you can see how that kind of, you don't even look at it really as a crime as much, but it is an offense, something that you're not allowed to do. Delinquency, on the other hand, is something that is, if I did it as an adult, whether I was 20, 30, 40, 50, or 60, or if you did it as a juvenile, if you were 10, 12, 14, 16, it's still a crime. So you stab someone, you beat someone, you assault someone, you burn down something. That's a delinquent act. So we either say you are a status offender, truancy being the number one, you don't go to school, or you're delinquent. We also changed some terminology, and this is pretty common when a new field emerges. One of the things that very often happens in a new field to kind of separate it from the old one is new vocabulary is developed. And so we don't use the term crime, we use the term delinquent act. We typically don't use the term complaint, criminal complaint, we use petition. We don't use the term arrest, we use the term intake, not conviction, but adjudication, not sentence, but disposition. So when you start seeing those terms, the ones there on the right side, act, petition, intake, adjudication, disposition, you can be pretty sure that you're dealing with something other than the regular court system. Alright, now this is a graph that shows that the major thing that's going to get you in trouble is truancy, and that is not going to school. So of the people that are referred into the system, you can see that truancy is 51%. The next largest one is liquor law violations. It's about 15%. Then you've got ungovernability, which basically means the child is out of control. You've got curfew violations, you've got running away from home, and then you've got everything else. So one of the biggest things is truancy, because this is a major issue. We feel that, and there are laws, that those individuals under the age of majority, it can be as young as 16, but usually it's 18, must be in school, must graduate. Now, early juvenile systems had very few safeguards. What was developing was a separate court system that didn't have the same due process protections that the regular one did. So, you get accused of a crime, you're going to get an attorney. There's going to be a case presented against you. You're going to have a right of appeal. You're going to have the right to be out on bail. Juvenile systems didn't have any of those things. Juveniles, once they were in the system, since it wasn't seen as a criminal process, had very few rights. And once you say this group of people has no rights, you can pretty much guess what's going to follow, and that's going to be abuse. You're going to have individuals that get sucked into the system. You're going to get individuals that are abused inside the system, and there's really no way they can fix it or complain. So there had to be changes. So when the United States Supreme Court, coming out of World War II, really was dominated by Earl Warren and Berger, these two courts, they really looked at a lot of these fundamental problems and said, we need more due process. So you have there's really these cases here, Galt, Kent, and Winship are the most important. Breed's important, but not as important. Starting really with Kent, and continuing all the way to, I would say, the last major one, although Breed is an important case, is Winship in 70. So in about 4 years, the Supreme Court of the United States says, let's really establish a parallel structure that looks a lot like the courts, because that's where you get protection. So the first thing they did was, let's give juveniles, if they're going to possibly transfer to adult court, and if they're going to get a hearing, let's give them representation, counsel. Now, in re Galt, which comes the next year, gives them much more. It's all the basic procedural safeguards that you get in adult court. Cross-examination, subpoena, right to call witnesses, the records, all those things. And then that's followed up a couple of years later with Winship, and finally ends out with Breed. So you've got really a 9-year period, 10-year period there where the Supreme Court of the United States basically told the states, okay, you have these separate systems, there's clear abuse going on in them, so we want you to really crack down and give these juveniles some representation. Well, this raises an obvious question. When are you a juvenile? And this is critical because remember I said some things are status offenses, some things are criminal acts like a delinquency, but some things are status offenses. So North Carolina traditionally said you were a juvenile between the ages of 6 and 16. Now remember, prior to 6, you're classified under the law as an infant. I know that's kind of a strange term, but it's just a generic term that we use. So from the date of your birth to your 6th birthday, you're an infant. You cannot be charged with any crime because you simply lack the capacity. Now in North Carolina, traditionally, between the ages of 6 and 16, you were a juvenile in most cases. Now that's pretty young because 16, you've still got some real developing to do. So in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, North Carolina modified this. Now it wasn't a complete reformation. It didn't say, okay, we're going to raise it to 18. It was left the same in some cases. The rule now is, if you're under 6, you're an infant. You can't be prosecuted. If you're between 6 and 15, you're going to be a juvenile. However, on your 16th and 17th, you still can be a juvenile, but there's a few cases up until your 18th birthday where it's easier to transfer you to an adult court. And these primarily are going to be crimes of violence. So what the North Carolina General Assembly did is they kind of put an asterisk next to that 18. I'm going to show you a graph of the United States in just a second, a map of the United States might make this a little bit more sensible. But we pretty much said 16 used to be when you were an adult. Now it's 18, your 18th birthday. But between those two ages, 16 and 18, so your 16th years and your 17th years, you still can be transferred out of juvie. So look at that chart there. You'll notice that North Carolina, technically, there's a couple ways you can be tried as an adult very early. For most states, there's no minimum age requirements, but 6 is pretty much here as the floor. And then I thought that cartoon was pretty good. Boy, this new study really shines an unfailing light on our juvenile policies, and it talks about how we've really arrested more people who are very young. Okay, here's some good news, because I guess when I give a lot of these and when I teach this can be rather depressing. And maybe you can go home and tell your parents this and make you feel better. Maybe make them feel a little bit worse. This is data through 2014. So if you think most of you are in your 20s, so it's 2022, so your parents were roughly your age, about the year 2000, maybe a little bit younger. You'll notice that if you compare what crimes they were committing versus what crimes you were committing, you as a generation, the generation that exists now, is much better behaved. And this is a shock to people, because if you say, well, how many aggravated assaults, and that would be basically people beating other people, it fell by 2/3. It fell from a high of about 300 per 100,000 people in the population. That would be peaking about 1998, 1996, down to right around 100. So it fell by 2/3. Robbery, physically taking an object from someone, again fell by half. It fell from a high of 200 all the way down to under 100. If you look at rape was running right around 25 per 100,000, and it fell to about 12. And perhaps the most critical, amazing thing is look at the homicides, about 15 per 100,000, and now it's down to 1. So it almost disappeared. You know, one of the things you could tell your parents if you wanted to, kiddingly, tease them a little bit, you could say, Mom, Dad, I'm a little disappointed in your generation. You killed a lot more people when you were our age. At least we're better. We don't kill as many people. All right, some of these trends then. The number of juvenile inmates decreased over time. Part of this was because juvenile curfews became a little bit rare, some quality of life crimes were not as enforced as much, and there were some local programs. However, and we're going to look at some hard numbers in a little bit for North Carolina school arrest rates I found, African Americans are overrepresented here. 6 in 10, or 60% of juvenile offenders in state custody belong to a minority group. So again, African Americans are about 12.5% of the American population. They're going to represent sometimes 30 or 40%. They're going to be 3 or 4 times as likely to be taken in. The other big thing is gender. What gender are you, male or female? We're going to keep the binary. We're not going to worry about transgender because there's really not very good statistics on any of that. Arrest rate for girls declined more slowly. Now still we arrest a lot more boys, and we'll look at the discrepancy. But we have seen a slower rate of decrease. So as a percentage, girls have gone up a little bit. So I guess you could say that to some extent feminism has been a little successful, kind of in a dark way. Here are those numbers from North Carolina. So increasingly there's a big role for schools here in delinquency. Many schools, most of you are just out of high school, many schools have school resource officers, and that's going to be police officers that are stationed inside schools. They also have physical things like cameras, controlled access. I found some numbers from before the pandemic here. In 2017, about 40% of referrals to the system, to the juvenile system, came from schools. So if you think about one of the impacts of placing school resource officers in, almost half, 40+%, of referrals that come in from these resource officers. Now, North Carolina has the third highest percentage of schools with police. In 2017, and this is, I found some numbers were like 2014 to 2017, so again, these are just rough. There were 239 arrests, or 0.1016% of the students in school were arrested, but 43% were black versus a school population of only 22%. So there was a vast overrepresentation by a factor of 2. There's also been, I would say, almost the criminalization of bullying. Physical, verbal, social, and even cyber abuse has really been looked at, and many states have enacted statutes, including North Carolina, that has criminalized some of this behavior. So we kind of had the emergence of a new type of delinquency there. Let's talk about delinquency and crime overall. Now, one of the most, there are two critical concepts, but one of the most important phrases or ideas you can bring out of our study of criminal justice over these last few weeks is this first one, aging out. Aging out is a well-established phenomenon, and there's no doubt that this is true. And that is simply that people are less likely to become criminals or engage in criminal activity the older they get. The other thing about aging out is if they have been committing crimes, they generally stop as they get older. So think about something like a physical assault. Let's suppose someone that fights and gets in a lot of fights. It's self-evident that someone, when they're 18, are physically, first of all, capable of getting in fights like that. But by the time you're 45 or 50, yes, you could still have a violent temper. Yes, you could still be engaging in fights. But you can see that their physical limitations by itself would make it less likely, much less the psychological implications. So if we look at the classic crime that girls as juveniles commit, that's shoplifting. By the time a female reaches her 20s, most of them have desisted. They have aged out of shoplifting. Very often what they will shoplift are basically trinkets, small things. Very, very young children might, I don't know, and I'm going to date myself here, steal a Pokemon card or a My Little Pony or something. Boy, I really did date myself. If we go forward, of course, it's a strange 25-year-old girl who is shoplifting My Little Pony figurines, although they exist, I suppose. The second thing to be aware of here, once you get the concept of aging out framed in your mind, is age of onset. At what age does a person start to commit crime or delinquent acts? And one of the things we know is the later that is, the better. And conversely, the earlier it is, the greater the danger. Although the type of act is critical. So if you commit a very minor crime, if you're in a schoolyard and you are 10 years old and you push someone and you get in a fist fight, okay, that's not great, but it's not a terrible thing. On the other hand, if you stab someone when you're 10, that's a pretty serious act. It's very young. Your age of onset is very, very young, and the severity of the crime is very high, so that would be very serious. So age of onset and aging out, two important concepts. Let's talk a little bit about substance abuse. And this is something that's tied up in so many things. There probably should be a separate chapter in our introduction just on drugs. But let's talk about substance abuse. We do have to be very careful about causation and correlation. The question always is, do drugs cause delinquency? So do taking drugs make you bad? Or are drugs a reflection of being a delinquent? So it's an analogy which is a little bit a little bit less tied up in social definitions and something is this. Let's suppose you have a soldier that comes home from war and he saw some traumatic events. Let's suppose he's suffering PTSD and he self-medicates by drinking. Okay, so in that case, what is causing him to drink? Well, it's the PTSD. So does PTSD cause that, or did the things before it cause it? What is the role of drugs there? And if you think about the role of alcohol to a veteran who is abusing or using it to deal with his stress, there isn't a moral judgment there, I don't think. You say, okay, well, he's suffering and he's trying to escape suffering by doing this. Versus, well, he's just a drunk, right? Same can be said of juveniles. Also, I think it's fair to ask what drugs matter. So we take all types of different drugs. One of the indicators of drug use is tobacco, nicotine. The drug of choice that's most routinely used is going to be tobacco, nicotine. Now, we don't view it necessarily as an evil, and this is in part because it's a status offense drug. So a 25-year-old can smoke a cigarette, buy a pack of cigarettes. A 10-year-old can't. Does tobacco use cause crime? Is it causative in the same way that I might say alcohol causes crime, or meth causes crime, or crack causes crime, or cocaine, or pick your drug? Or is it merely something that is associated with something else? There's some underlying trigger. One of the things we do know when we start to look at rates of substance abuse is that it matters very much if tobacco is used in homes. If two parents are present and both parents smoke tobacco, the probability that the child will use drugs is increased dramatically. If both parents are abstainers from tobacco, that's a better indicator the child won't use illicit drugs than even if both parents don't drink. All right, let's talk about the kind of flip side. We've been talking about when juveniles misbehave. Well, let's talk about when people hurt them. So we really have abuse and neglect. Abuse is, something in the 30-odd years that I've been an attorney that I guess my greatest takeaway is that if you want to look for a fundamental problem in the system, it's this. Childhood abuse and childhood neglect create or feed into or enabling factors of so many of the crimes that adults will later commit. So and I know it's a bit of a trope, but I think there's some truth there. If you have a prostitute, you can often go back into their childhood and see that they were sexually abused as a child, which makes that a little bit less a victimless crime if you think about it. You will have people that say, well, yes, I visit prostitutes, but they're willing. They are selling their bodies to me for this money. But if I told you, well, the reason they did that is they were raped and abused as a child by their parents or by an adult in their household, and they developed this unhealthy and perverse view of sexual behavior, all of a sudden your use of their body becomes a little bit less consensual and a little bit less a victimless crime. So we do have child abuse, child neglect. What's abuse? Abuse is the intentional infliction of physical or emotional pain. And again, this runs the gauntlet all the way from things that, some people might say, well, that's just what kids got to do. They got to be tough growing up. Sometimes their parents are going to yell at them. Sometimes their parents are going to tell them they're worthless or bad, to things like parents breaking a child's bones, or parents committing horrific acts, sometimes killing children, sometimes raping children. Sometimes it's not the actual action. Okay, it's not an overt act. Okay, it's not a crime of commission where a parent or the person in charge does something. It's a crime of omission where they fail to do something, and this is neglect, where they fail to give the child basic food, basic shelter, basic care, or love. our best evidence is about 10% of all children in the United States suffer some form of abuse or neglect from family members. And this will at least double the chances when that child grows up that they will engage in crimes. And again, we have, is this causative or is this correlative? But I think, child neglect, child abuse is the gift that keeps giving to the criminal justice system. It's one of the root causes. All right, a little bit about gangs. We looked at last week when we talked about gangs. We looked last week at gangs that formed in prison, STGs. We're going to look at gangs, street gangs, primarily populated by juveniles. And part of this is, through different studies, juveniles trying to recreate a family environment, give themselves a sense of identity, protection, fellowship. Gangs simply being defined as 3 or more people who separate themselves by clothing, by vocabulary, by signals, by names, and they often engage in criminal activity. Now, some of that is status offending, a gang hanging out at night, a gang drinking liquor. Some of it is actual delinquency. Juveniles who suffer abuse and neglect are far more likely to join a gang than those that don't. Typical gang membership is late teens. And here's an interesting phenomenon, and this has been a real conundrum for criminal justice people who study it, criminologists, is that there's a very strong ethnic component. About 10% are white, which is a vast underrepresentation. About 32% are African American, so about 3 times, but 53% of gang members are Hispanic. So this raises all sorts of questions about why is there such a strong ethnic component here? And there's been different potential explanations explored. One is that these are immigrant communities coming in. Immigrants tend to move through a hierarchy of development where very often the first wave of immigrants are going to be overrepresented in the criminal justice as criminals. The second generation very often joins law enforcement. So, the famous pattern here, you could take the Irish. The Irish come in large numbers in the United States in the 1840s. 1848 is the Great Irish Potato Famine. Immigration wave starts coming. And then you have the gangs, the Irish gangs that are major problems for the cities on the East Coast. And this is all through the 1860s, 1870s. Now by the 1880s, 1890s, this is the second generation of Irishmen. So it's their children that have been here. You begin to see that the children of these immigrants, and these immigrants might often have joined gangs, have joined the police departments. So this is where you get the stereotypical Irish cop that you see in a lot of the old black and white movies. By the next generation up, they're becoming the lawyers and the judges. And by the 3rd or 4th generation up, they're becoming the presidents and the senators. This is if you look at the Kennedys in the United States. So this may be what's called ethnic succession. If America's here in 100 years and you come back, and let's suppose we had a big influx, make up a imaginary immigration group. We had a lot of people move here from Tibet, right? You might say, oh, well, how many people from Tibet are in gangs? It's 53%, because they might be that immigrant group coming in at first. Okay, typical gang members come from lower social and economic groups, but that's changed a little bit. They usually are urban-based. They have expanded into rural and suburban communities because that's where population centers are, but it's not been complete. And they are predominantly male. There are females, but it's predominantly male. Okay, let's talk about the first contact, the police and pretrial. About 600,000 juveniles are arrested every year. And this is where the state or the police begin to stand, and we're going to use a Latin term, loco parentis, in the place of the parent. So very often the system is going to act in the best interest of the child, even if the child doesn't recognize it or if the parents are ignoring them. And the police at this point are going to have tremendous power because they're going to be able to look at something that isn't a crime, it's a status offense, right? And they're going to decide, do I escalate this? Do I bring this into the formal system? So, obviously, why? What factors do they consider? What offense is committed? I mean, if it is a delinquent act, if it's a stabbing, a shooting, you're going to go through the system. If it's something like truancy, cops may not be that interested. What's the offender's past record? Have they been arrested? Have they been in contact with the system before? Where did this occur? School? Home? Is there a family that can deal with and discipline the offender? What is the offender's attitude, and what's the offender's gender? Because males are more likely to get arrested. All right, so as I said before, minorities are vastly overrepresented here, and blacks or African Americans are twice as likely to be referred to the system as whites. But if you control for that, it seems to be that the attitude of the offender is a key. And I can't tell you how many times I had a client for a speeding ticket or something who told me, oh yeah, when I got pulled over, I gave that cop a piece of my mind. I told him, I pay your salary and you're going to do this to me. Well, that's not going to get you out of the ticket. The cop isn't going to say, oh, you're right. Gee, I should never write you a ticket because you pay taxes. If you give that cop guff, if you challenge his authority, if you belittle him, yell at him, he's going to react like any other human being would. He is not going to rip up the ticket. He is not going to not arrest you. And some of this, of course, will play into, are you a different race than the cop? Certainly you're a different age, and we tend not to respect, if you're an adult, someone younger than you. Ethnicity can play a role here too. All right, so intake is typically done either by an arrest or a petition. Now, a petition is a formal document that is filed with the court, and it can be initiated by a parent sometimes. It can be initiated by a police officer or a juvenile officer. It can be by a truant officer. And it's going to be filed with the court that said you're a delinquent or a status offender. Now, there's going to be a review here at this point to decide if you're going over to adult court. If you committed a homicide and you're 17, you're going to get tried as an adult. You're not going to be able to stay in juvie. It's just not going to happen, absent a great attorney in real unusual circumstances. So depending upon what the crime was, depending upon what the prosecution wants to do, what the legislator, the law says, you may or may not wind up at this point going over to the juvenile system or to the regular system. Some crimes are automatic, like a homicide. Okay, here's where lawyers get into it quite a bit, and this is why you hire lawyers in this system. You want diversion. You want to make sure that you're going to get these low-risk offenders out of the formal system, usually by placing them in some community-based rehabilitation, so that no record appears. You might get probation, you might get treatment and aid, you might get restitution. So a big thing that you do as an attorney here is, if the intake petition was because a juvenile had committed a theft, had broken into a neighbor's house, you make darn sure that whatever he stole was replaced, whatever damages were paid for, so that restitution was made to the victim. The judge at that point is going to be much more willing and able to divert the case or give probation or treatment. And this is a fear of labeling. If once you say you're a criminal, this can lead to him saying, okay, I'm a criminal. I'm going to behave that way in the future. If you give them another chance, and this is difficult, but if you give them another chance, they may not screw up. All right, so transferring to adult court, as I said, not as common. It's got to be pretty serious. More juveniles go than used to because of the get tough approach, but it only runs about $4,000 a year. North Carolina, we have a discretionary waiver where it's up to the judge, but we also have a mandatory waiver. If you commit murder after the age of 13, you're going to get tried as an adult in North Carolina, surprisingly enough. All right, detention. After you are brought in, your intake, okay, you are placed in a secure facility. Now, very often in North Carolina, that's going to be a jail. And the big issue here is, do you have separate facilities? Because these jails are underfunded and small, and in the rural counties, they're old. So hopefully it's separate, but often it's not. It's in the general population. And this is where juveniles can be abused inside jails. Most have a detention hearing within 24 hours, and the question is, do you go forward? Do you keep holding the juvenile? And you ask questions like, are they a danger to the community? Will they return? Are they in danger themselves of being injured? because very often the juvenile is both an offender and a victim here. All right, we're going to have an adjudication where this is the trial. We're going to determine what to do. And we're really in a juvenile court more interested in what's best for the juvenile as opposed to taking vengeance, retribution, just desserts. Most states specify the procedure has to be followed. It's not quite as formal. It's a more relaxed system than the typical criminal system. At the end of it, the judge will rule on what he's going to do, or she's going to do. And they will determine whether the respondent is a delinquent and needs court supervision. So then you're going to have disposition, or the sentencing. And typically judges will order a predisposition report. And this is really important for juveniles. Like, okay, the juvenile's been acting up. Can I send him home? Is there a better option? Is there a grandparent, someone like that? And judges have a lot of discretion here. And they can choose between, we're going to give you some sort of treatment, we're going to put you on probation, or we're going to incarcerate you in a secure facility, a juvenile detention facility. And he's going to look at what offense, what's your history, what's the family situation, and the attitude again. And those are just the overt ones. You can look at ones that are a little less subtle, like what's the gender, what's the race. Probation is by far the most common one. The majorities will never receive anything more severe than probation. It's very similar to adult probation. Confinement is rare, less than 10%. Maybe slightly over 10%. About 54,000 are incarcerated in some sort of juvenile facilities. And it used to have all sorts of names like juvie or reform school. It can be non-secure, like foster care, group homes, rural programs, or it can be secure, including things like boot camps and training schools. Very often, though, there's more of a follow-through than there is for adults, where we're looking at educational and counseling, because I think we believe in society the juvenile can be saved easier than the adult can. They can be put on a new path. So very often there is an attempt at aftercare here. All right, as I said, we cut this right at about 50 minutes. This is going to conclude the course. We've done all 15 chapters, so I'm appreciative that you guys stayed attention to the very end here. I will be preparing over the next few months micro lectures, so these are going to be additional lectures that are going to cover some of these topics in a little bit more detail. I'm going to be soliciting from different individuals in my department what they would like, and this is going to be open to students, what they would like. So unfortunately, for those of you that are just strictly watching online, probably I will not be taking suggestions from the internet, but if you are in one of my classes and you're watching this and you say, well, gee, Mr. Chapman, I don't understand the whole, this chapter we just covered was juveniles, this whole house of refuge, could you do a 5-minute lecture on that? I'll be happy to do those, and I'm going to start creating those over the next year or so and adding them very gradually. But other than that, I hope you all enjoyed listening to this, and I hope you learned something. Have a great life, everyone.